After decades of meticulously concealed chaos, whispers that were previously restricted to private hallways have finally surfaced. Witnesses claim that Prince Andrew's actions at private parties where the elite and royalty mingled weren't just improper. Even for his supporters, it was shocking, unrelenting, and humiliating. His extensive history of wrongdoing, which included both unsettling demands and moments that left entire rooms in disbelief, is now unavoidable. What actually took place at those parties, though? And why, after all these years, are insiders finally speaking up? The word was never learned by the prince. No. Like so many of his stories, it started with an initially innocuous incident. Deep within Buckingham Palace, 72 teddy bears were strategically positioned across Prince Andrew's bed. The staff didn't laugh at the sight, but anyone else might have. A laminated photograph that detailed the precise placement, angle, and order of each teddy bear had been provided to them. His irate yells would fill the silent hallways if even one was a little out of place. As if the bears were ceremonial guards rather than childhood artifacts, servants learned to repeat the pattern word for word. It was a window into a mind that insisted that the world conform to its comfort. However, this behavior took time to manifest. Long before Prince Andrew was given titles and privileges as an adult, it had been developing for years. Rumors started to spread among people who knew him in the late 1970s, when he was still a teenager. A strange night at a country house party was described by one writer. The house was dark and quiet, with a number of young women sleeping in their rooms, when the door abruptly opened at 2 a.m. Prince Andrew was standing there, saying he had to share their bed because a ghost had scared him. They immediately threw him out. It was a revealing act, but it was also stupid and invasive. Music, Prince Andrew behaved as though everyone would just accept whatever he wanted, even at the age of 17. Another gathering, this time during a peaceful morning routine, brought up a similar memory. In her ensuite bathroom, a barely conscious young woman was brushing her teeth when Prince Andrew entered without knocking. Rather than offer an apology, he gave her a spontaneous lesson on how to brush properly, as if entering a private area gave him the right to correct her. It was not a charming or eccentric moment. It served as a disturbing reminder that limits were only important when they belonged to him. These tales lingered over time like sporadic cautions, tiny indicators of a more significant trend that would intensify with time. People who came into contact with Prince Andrew said the same thing over and over. He acted as if women only existed to amuse him, respond to him, and blend in with his world. His humor was frequently veiled in contempt, his presence in entitlement, and his attention in demands. These accounts persist not only because of the deeds but also because of the circumstances that permitted them to persist inside the royal walls. The peculiarities of Prince Andrew were accepted, even accommodated. Employees learned to avoid causing annoyance. In order to move on, friends learned to roll their eyes. In the shadows of palaces, private estates, and social circles more inclined to shrug than to confront, the habits thrived because the outside world hardly ever heard a whisper. The indications were no longer subtle by the time Prince Andrew rose to prominence in society as an adult. One presumption appeared to govern his treatment of women in particular. His emotions came first. Everyone else was supposed to join in if something made him laugh. The mood quickly shifted if something bothered him. Some recalled abrupt mood swings over insignificant things, such as an item that was misplaced or a remark that was made at the wrong moment. Others remembered times when Prince Andrew acted as if everyone in the room was an audience and every room he went into was his stage. Oddly enough, the teddy bears ended up being one of the most obvious representations of that enduring attitude. They were set up for control, not sentimentality. Precious childhood memories were not shielded by the laminated card kept in the bedroom drawer. It served as a manual for obedience. Prince Andrew expected everyone to share his tastes, so staff had to comply. The consistency that underlies these occurrences rather than the peculiarities of each individual moment is what unites them. The man who insisted on having his toys arranged like ceremonial relics was the boy who broke into girls' bedrooms without permission. He developed into the adult who exploded when things didn't look the way he wanted them to, from the teenager who lectured a stranger in her own bathroom. The pattern persisted decade after decade. Boundaries weren't rules, they were suggestions. The configuration was altered. Private suites, royal homes, and country estates. However, Prince Andrew's actions did not change. As time passed, those early tales, which had previously been dismissed as innocuous anecdotes, began to resemble markers pointing to a more significant reality. They exposed a man who had been molded by the constant reinforcement of privilege rather than by responsibility, someone who confused indulgence for affection and entitlement for power. The picture of the 72 teddy bears is still more than just an oddity. It is a subdued, eerie reminder of a life spent in a bubble where nobody ever said no, and even the most basic things became emblems of a more profound, long-standing pattern. One based on expectation, intrusion, and the conviction that Prince Andrews must always have his way. What secret realities about Prince Andrew's domineering, untouchable ways did those closest to the monarchy observe if the world always yielded to his will? Darkness behind the walls of the palace. Those who worked closest to the monarchy already had a quiet understanding long before rumors became stories. Prince Andrew had a unique way of navigating the world. Not just because he was born into a position of privilege, but also because he exuded an air of entitlement that allowed him to intimidate, humiliate, or control anyone who came into contact with him. The atmosphere surrounding him was shaped by his status as the Queen's favored son. A silence followed him into every room, corridor, and gathering. When Prince Andrew's footsteps reverberated down a hallway, tension would rise, as those who worked in royal households remember. Staff whispered warnings to each other on weekends at country estates across England as early as the late 1990s, but not because they were afraid of making a mistake. Errors occur in every workplace, but Prince Andrew frequently took them personally. A tray delivered a minute too late or a napkin folded slightly off-center could set off a chain reaction of rage against young employees who were hardly old enough to have left school. The shouting wasn't the only thing that made people uneasy, the unpredictable nature of it also did. Prince Andrew might walk through a drawing room one day with a fake charm. The next time, he could make an innocuous exchange into an embarrassing spectacle. Former visitors and domestic staff described these experiences with a mix of resignation and incredulity. They claimed that his antics weren't the light-hearted mischief of a man attempting to diffuse a formal royal setting. They were purposeful displays of authority. Between 1995 and 2002, Prince Andrew was known to enter rooms without permission, frequently late at night, at social events, particularly those hosted in opulent country homes. At first, some visitors thought it was harmless curiosity or an ineffective attempt to socialize, but the pattern quickly became apparent. Without knocking, Prince Andrew would swing open doors and look around the room as if looking for someone or something. One woman remembered the awkward time Prince Andrew stopped in her doorway, inspected her as if she were a piece of merchandise, and said he was shopping for amusement. It was clear from his tone that he didn't expect any objections. Those who spent time with Prince Andrews whispered stories about his alleged jokes. During a private event where guests were enjoying a formal dinner, one such incident happened. Prince Andrew pretended to sniff the air, but a young woman was actually carrying a plate of pâté. "It smelled terrible," he said loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. Prince Andrew pushed her face toward the plate as she bent down to examine it, laughing as if he had pulled off some kind of spectacular comedy. There was silence in the room, but it wasn't confusion. It was a fear of what would occur if he faced opposition. These uncomfortable moments seemed to be enjoyable to him. Prince Andrew was pointing a fire extinguisher straight at a woman's face when she woke up from another house party. According to witnesses, Prince Andrew used it to blast rooms all night long, leaving a path of mayhem and yelling visitors behind. He viewed the terror he incited as a source of amusement, loitering in doorways to observe reactions before pursuing the next victim. Younger employees frequently took the brunt of Prince Andrew's rage, especially teenage maids hired from small towns to work in historic homes. Some were dependent on their income, far from home, and only 18. This seemed to be understood and applied by Prince Andrew. An imperfectly polished glass or a request that wasn't fulfilled at an impossible pace served as justification for him to abuse his power. As he chastised them for mistakes too small to warrant the brutality, his harsh, authoritative voice would reverberate through the corridor. Prince Andrew introduced games at weekend get-togethers that were supposed to be light-hearted but instead made many people feel cornered. Visitors recall being made to march through elaborate rooms in long chains, resembling a children's parade. According to others, Prince Andrew insisted that they stand uncomfortable close to each other during fruit-passing games, pushing boundaries in the name of amusement. His famous mustard trick, music, in which he squirted mustard onto someone's face while feigning an accident, turned into a routine that he carried out time and time again, laughing louder than everyone else. A pattern became apparent across years and estates. Humor cloaked in embarrassment. Dominance concealed in rank, intrusion disguised as friendliness. Those who observed Prince Andrew's actions described them as part of a continuous environment in which his royal protection served as a buffer against repercussions rather than as isolated incidents. The tales show something far darker beneath the glittering exterior of royal tradition. Prince Andrew pushed boundaries because no one could tell him he couldn't, not because he could. In the royal corridors, could his unbridled charm truly conceal a recklessness that would soon leave a mark well beyond the palace walls, testing patience and expectations? Prince Andrew, public scandal, privilege, and power. Andrew had a reputation for reckless charm in the corridors of the palace long before the world got a full glimpse of his antics. The young prince, who was frequently praised for his connections and position, occasionally allowed his privilege to slip into recklessness, trying the patience of those around him. By 1981, this inclination would not only annoy courtiers but also have a global impact. In a show of royal respect, Andrew was given a lavish vacation in Egypt that year. In an effort to show respect for other countries and the dignity owed to the British royal family, President Anwar Sadat himself offered to use the presidential jet. It ought to have been an achievement in diplomacy. However, Andrew's actions quickly transformed civility into disaster. The trip's reports vividly depict excess and impropriety. Witnesses recount how, at one opulent event in Cairo, he leaped into a swimming pool while fully clothed, dragging a female guest along in a spectacular display that astounded the elite in attendance. He was followed by laughter, though not everyone laughed. While Andrew, apparently unaware of the seriousness of his actions, treated the incident as a private joke, the woman came out looking ashamed in front of Egyptian high society. It was more than bad taste. It was a blunder on the international scene, a reflection of a prince whose personal tendencies were already overflowing into public disgrace. Palace servants frequently found it difficult to control Andrew's conduct behind closed doors. Even senior courtiers found it difficult to set boundaries because of his charm and prestige. However, as his errors mounted, it became evident that the prince's carelessness had reached a breaking point. These incidents, whether they occurred during well-publicized international travel or at local social gatherings, portrayed a person for whom privilege appeared to absolve consequences. The incident in Cairo was by no means unique. Other incidents that combined humor and embarrassment, where Andrew's confidence went too far, are related by friends, employees, and sporadic reporters. However, every tale heightened the tension. The disparity between the prince's personal entitlement complex and the obligations associated with his position as a monarch. Every chuckle he made overseas was weighed against the country's opinion. Often, diplomats and hosts who expected a representative of the crown to act with decorum were left in confusion or embarrassment. Andrew's actions would have unanticipated consequences. Early occurrences were written off as immature transgressions, but the pattern started to damage his reputation. What started out as a personal battle with impulse turned into a public lesson about the thin line separating charm and impropriety. When foreign dignitaries began to share their memories, it was no longer anecdotal but rather a diplomatic embarrassment that would follow him for years in rumors and reports. Specifically, the trip to Egypt in 1981 came to represent Andrew's complex relationship with his surroundings. There was unimaginable wealth, privilege, and access, but there was also a lack of self-control that attracted attention, often in the wrong way. Simple holiday stories became cautionary tales due to inappropriate laughter, humiliating pranks, and an apparent lack of decorum. What could have been an ordinary royal visit turned into a representation of unbridled privilege. An episode that would be remembered for its awkward, even shocking, moments on the international stage rather than its diplomatic warmth. When one considers Andrew's early adulthood, a pattern becomes apparent. Although he was a person who moved fluidly between prestige and power, he found it difficult to acknowledge the consequences of his own behavior. Every slip-up, from careless excess to dubious decision-making, exposed a conflict at the core of royal life. The difference between self-indulgence and responsibility, expectation and impulse. The outside world finally got a glimpse of what insiders already knew, even though the palace frequently covered up incidents that happened behind closed doors. Andrew may act in a way that is unpredictable and has significant ramifications. These incidents had repercussions beyond simple social humiliation. They served as a reminder of the brittleness of reputation and the delicate equilibrium between privilege and responsibility. Andrew's reputation would fluctuate between public fascination and private worry in the years after the Egyptian holiday. His actions were examined not only as the conduct of a young man but also as that of a prince whose every action had an impact on the monarchy. In this way, the Cairo incident and other incidents acted as early warning indicators, hinting at how a life of exceptional opportunity could be jeopardized by poor decision-making, leaving a legacy that was both remarkable and contentious. What startling effect did Prince Andrew's actual behavior have on the very legacy he sought to preserve, though, when those close to him saw it? Stories of entitlement and conceit. When Prince Andrew walked in, the room seemed to get smaller, not because he was charming or charismatic, but because his very presence commanded attention. Those around him soon discovered that when interacting with someone whose entire world revolved around himself, manners, respect, or basic human decency were not required. His actions were invariably contemptuous, occasionally incredibly harsh, and always encased in a blatant sense of entitlement that unnerved bystanders. His haughtiness was felt by everyone, from longtime employees to casual acquaintances. The tiniest annoyances turned into platforms for Prince Andrew's privilege. Police would be called in to retrieve a stray golf ball that rolled into the backyard garden. As though the world was created just for him. Employees weren't co-workers. They were props meant to foresee his whims and suffer humiliation in silence. Dinners, social events, and formal occasions frequently devolved into awkward displays of power dynamics, with his laughter directed at those he considered inferior. Certain incidents gained notoriety and were discussed in high society for many years. Broadcaster Tanya Breyer experienced an incident in 1992 that would stick in people's memories for a long time. Prince Andrew allegedly approached her from behind and unzipped her dress in public during a society event. His sense of superiority seemed to be bolstered by the stunned silence, awkward laughter, and gasps that followed. Witnesses were shocked and outraged by the moment, which demonstrated a profound disregard for both personal boundaries and basic decency. This pattern recurred in more subdued but no less devastating ways. He allegedly made fun of an 18-year-old secretary at a dinner in Windsor Castle, loudly declaring her work uninteresting and unworthy of notice. It appeared to onlookers to be a show of power used solely for entertainment. A sobering reminder that respect in Prince Andrew's eyes was only earned by conforming to his limited standards of value rather than by hard work or merit. Sitting next to him was a test of endurance, according to friends and insiders, as the conversation frequently turned into criticism of women's attire or other unimportant personal issues, turning everyone around him into objects for his amusement. Prince Andrews did not act impulsively or infrequently, according to observers. It was routine. It appeared that privilege was a lens through which he viewed every encounter rather than just a situation of birth. It influenced his handling of situations, interactions with co-workers, and sense of humor. There was often laughter in the room at the expense of another person's honor. A cruel calculation in which the weak were degraded and the powerful were amused. However, beneath the exterior of haughtiness, there was a persistent fixation with looks, social standing, and status. Every interaction turned into a chance for Prince Andrew to show off his superiority and remind everyone of his high status. In particular, women frequently attracted his attention in invasive and objectifying ways, and he was rarely punished right away for such actions. It seemed as though the burden of privilege could protect even the most unacceptable behavior from criticism, leaving a path of unease, rage, and hushed tales in its wake. A distinct pattern can be seen in all of this. Unbridled entitlement, laughter at the misfortune of others, and an unrelenting desire to be the center of attention. Events such as those involving Tanya Breyer and the young secretary at Windsor Castle were not isolated mistakes, rather, they were indicative of a larger worldview in which manners, rules, and empathy were applied inconsistently, if at all. Many people questioned how such behavior could be accepted, justified, or even normalized in elite circles because the shock and outrage these acts caused lasted far longer than the brief laughter they sparked. In the end, the picture that emerges is one of a man who was characterized by both privilege and conceit. The pattern is clear, ranging from insignificant requests to instances of blatant cruelty. Boundaries, empathy, and discretion were annoyances rather than guiding principles to Prince Andrew, who was used to getting his way. Recounting these incidents makes it evident that the spectacle of entitlement left a lasting impression, not just because of what he did but also because of the culture of acquiescence that permitted it and the people who put up with it, frequently in silence, while the world looked on. These tales are still told in memoirs or whispered among social circles decades later, serving as a reminder that the influence of privilege can be felt well beyond the boundaries of private estates and palaces. Music, testament to the power dynamics and unbridled entitlement that shaped Prince Andrew's life and the lives of those around him. The memory is frequently unsettling, occasionally enraging, but always unforgettable for those who encountered him. How, then, did Prince Andrew's unbridled entitlement enable him to exercise power without consequence, impacting everyone in his vicinity in ways that few could have predicted? When entitlement and consequence collide. Prince Andrew walked the halls of power with an unchallenged sense of freedom for decades. A society in which privilege concealed actions that would have disturbed the average person. His charm could turn cruel, and his jokes, music, were rarely harmless, as those around him, staff, acquaintances, and the young women he attracted, quickly discovered. They were scathing, calculated, and degrading. His antics were characterized by observers such as author Andrew Looney as a combination of juvenile mischief and entitlement, with the purpose of provoking and dominating rather than being the harmless eccentricities of royalty. There was no mischief. It was a weapon. According to accounts, he was a man who was used to having the world bend around him and who felt empowered by the monarchy's protective walls. A long-standing pattern of behavior that seemed untouchable for decades was created when complaints were ignored or subtly silenced. Employees feared retaliation. There were no illusions of consequence, and witnesses were disregarded. In this world, dishonesty was protected by power, and audacity flourished under the guise of aristocracy. In a description that shocked some and confirmed the darkest suspicions of others, Jeffrey Epstein, whose name would forever be associated with scandal, once called Andrew the King of Kink, saying he was more perverted than I am. Despite his boldness, Andrew's protective bubble was brittle, and fissures were beginning to appear. A pivotal moment occurred on November 6, a date that will live on in contemporary royal history. With decisive power, King Charles deprived Andrew of all royal patronages and military connections. The gesture wasn't just symbolic. It was an official admission that decades of privilege could no longer cover wrongdoing. It was a public admission that entitlement has its boundaries and that not all wrongdoing could be contained within the walls of royalty. The findings themselves are astounding. There is a recurring theme in the stories about Andrew's treatment of young women and employees. Exploitation as a habit, humiliation as amusement, and a hierarchy where his whims took precedence over morality. A disturbing casualness in his use of power was noted by many who watched him in private settings. There was frequently a dark undertone to things that seemed strange or awkward at first. Employees were torn between loyalty and fear. Witnesses who might have raised their voices faced social repercussions and an unbreakable web of intimidation. Every dismissed accusation and disregarded grievance strengthened his conviction that he was untouchable. The public is left feeling both fascinated and incredulous after witnessing the result of years of silent rumors and half-heard whispers. How could someone from one of the most closely watched families in history get away with it for so long? The systemic safeguards that enveloped him contain some of the truth. The tendency of the monarchy to prioritize reputation over responsibility. In actuality, the palace fostered an atmosphere that accepted and occasionally even encouraged conceit and entitlement. Because of the long-standing shield surrounding him, Andrew was able to exploit, intimidate, and humiliate people while feeling secure in the knowledge that the repercussions were far off. However, that delusion was destroyed on November 6. Titles were taken away for reasons other than punishment. It was symbolic. It conveyed the message that testimony and documentation could overcome privilege and that history would not be silent. Furthermore, the palace's inaction had allowed Andrew's actions to continue even though they had been documented, reported, and occasionally discussed in whispers over the course of decades. For the first time, the world realized that what seemed like conceit or eccentricity was actually a deeply ingrained entitlement pattern that had practical repercussions for people around him. The wider ramifications are significant. There are still unanswered questions about why more witnesses did not come forward sooner and why the systems put in place to protect the weak moved so slowly. Every story of Andrew's wrongdoing and every humiliation he endured in private spaces points to an almost systemic failure brought on by a mix of power, fear, and the weight of long-standing customs. However, the public reckoning now compels introspection. Even centuries-old institutions are susceptible to scrutiny, and the barriers of privilege can come down. Ultimately, Andrew's story serves as a warning about unbridled power rather than merely documenting one man's excesses. No matter how gilded, entitlement cannot stay hidden indefinitely. The carefully maintained illusion of untouchability, the silence complaints, and the humiliations all culminated in the moment when the consequences finally materialized. Furthermore, the November 6 title stripping makes a clear statement, even though some people may still question what might have been avoided had action been taken sooner. Cruelty is not justified by privilege, and history recalls. The question now hangs over the horizon. Will silence continue to protect the powerful, or will others rise up, inspired by this moment? The story of Andrew's entitlement serves as a sobering reminder that even the safest lives are vulnerable to the passage of time, the truth, and public scrutiny. Power may provide temporary protection in the modern era, but once consequences are initiated, they may not be reversed. What, in your opinion, led Andrew to think he could control and degrade everyone at his parties for decades? We want to know what you think. Remember to share and like.